My own background was as a school teacher and school administrator and in Boston and in South Carolina. And when I really had no interest in being a researcher. In fact, the day I arrived at I went to Stanford for my graduate training, but I originally went as a master's degree student. And immediately prior to going to Stanford, I was actually a teacher and administrator in rural South Carolina. And that my experience was hanging all over me, to the extent that the day I arrived at Stanford, one of my advisor was Dan Duke, now at the University of Virginia. And Dan asked me what I was hoping to learn during my graduate studies, and I told him all of my practitioner-oriented dreams about what I wanted to get out. And one after another, he just knocked them down one after another. And finally I said, "Are you telling me that I ought to get out of town by sundown?" And he said, "Well, in so many words, yes, unless you can change your expectations, because the things that you're telling me you want to get out of your graduate training, you're not going to get here at Stanford, because that's not what we do here. And so if you can change your expectations, I think you could have a very rich experience here, but not what you think you came for." And he then nicknamed me Conrack, which was after a teacher in same guy who wrote, Pat Conroy, wrote the book about a teacher in rural South Carolina. So my nickname during my time at Stanford was Conrack. So that's how I came into my life as a researcher, was very much as a practitioner. And I actually think that's enriched my work. One of my doctoral advisors was Ed Bridges, who had written an article in 1967 in the Journal of Educational Administration, which was talking about what is instructional leadership and trying to get a better definition. And so really my doctoral dissertation was to come up with a conceptual definition of instructional leadership, as well as an instrument that could measure it. Mm-hmm. So over the past 30 years, that's really where my research has, I've gone in lots of different directions, but really at the core of it is trying to understand how do leaders make a difference for the quality of teaching and learning in schools. And that work has intersected over time with work with collaborators like Joe Murphy, with whom I worked very closely during the 1980s, and Ken Leithwood and Ron Heck in the 1990s, and then continuing with Ron Heck most recently, as well as other colleagues over the years. But it's really been, in the early days, trying to develop research tools, and then over the next 25 years, conduct a variety of different types of studies, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, trying to get at what it is that school leaders, principals in particular, but leaders more broadly as well, do that makes a difference for the quality of teaching and learning. If you ask me my focus now, I need to, again, go back. And if I go back to 1991, because in 1991 I had a Fulbright fellowship to Chiang Mai University in Thailand. And in a sense, I never came back from my Fulbright. I did, but in a sense I didn't, because between 1992 and 2000, I ended up spending half of my year, I was a professor at Vanderbilt at that point, but I was spending half the year at Vanderbilt and half the year in Chiang Mai in Thailand. And over the years, I could say my center of gravity gradually shifted from Vanderbilt in the US over to Chiang Mai and to Thailand. And so that also is reflected in my research, which although still remained on instructional leadership and principal leadership and leadership development, the locus, if not the focus, but the locus of it shifted more from the US over to Asia. We have a 7-country project trying to define instructional leadership from an indigenous perspective in each of these societies, in mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, and Malaysia. In 1995, I wrote an article in the UCEA Review which was really, I think, the first article written in the field making a case for why we need to look at educational leadership from a cross-cultural perspective, because literally 99% of the published literature as of 1995, and it hasn't changed that much since then, has come from the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. That's and and there's a whole big world out there that's a whole lot bigger than those countries, and educational leadership doesn't look the same. And as with globalization, which has really only taken off since 1995 when I wrote that article, the policies that get thrust across the world are very much based upon a very narrow set of contexts in which we've done research. So all the research on educational leadership, school leadership effects, and so forth really comes from a very narrow cultural context. Yet the policies go all over the world and are being implemented, like in Malaysia, they're now requiring principals to be instructional leaders. And they actually have policies saying you have to spend X amount of time in classrooms. And yet none of that research really comes from Malaysia. And so I think this, rather than sort of this policy borrowing based upon very narrow context in which we've done research, we really need to expand that. So that's what I'm about.